Like the technology companies in Silicon Valley, I don't think I fully saw how malign actors could use the weaknesses of the internet. I didn't support these open standards enough. I went with the corporations, and we needed the corporations to do a lot of good things, but we also needed to support that essence of the internet. So I am an optimist to the extent that I know it's possible that we could continue to do great things with it, but we could also screw it up.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program, How We Reclaim the Internet with Jeff Jarvis. Thank you for joining us to explore the Internet's past, present, and future, and the role we, the builders, users, and shapers of the web, play in its development. My name is Rachel Myrow, and I'm Senior Editor of KQED's Silicon Valley News Desk. Joining me tonight, as I mentioned, is Jeff Jarvis, a journalist and co-host of two podcasts, This Week in Google and AI Inside. He's also the author of What Would Google Do? Public Parts, How Sharing in the Digital Age Improves the Way We Work and Live, and his new book, The Web We Weave, Why We Must Reclaim the Internet from Moguls, Misanthropes, and Moral Panic. Well, Jeff, I thought I might start with the first couple of paragraphs from Chapter 1 of The Web We Weave, because it really sums up a lot of the territory you cover in this book. So bear with me, it's a bit wordy. It's
what I do. Yeah.
Remember the word it. It has been accused of corrupting the morals of youth and of nations, aggravating anxiety, exploiting our emotions, seducing the vulnerable into escaping from reality, subverting truth, undermining the authority of institutions, invading home and family, wasting time, cheapening the culture, and peddling pornography. Countless calls have been made to regulate and tax it, and even to ban it as an emblem of greed and capitalism at the lowest ebb. Not to mention that it has been implicated as a cause of ruined eyesight and posture, addiction, overdoses, and even suicide. Have you guessed now that it was the novel? Not too shabby there. But talk about that. You dug into history to find that new technologies have been terrifying us for a very long time.
Yes, I'm not sure whether they really terrify us or whether we media folks exploit and cause terror to make money. And I think the moral panics around technology go way back to the novel, for God's sakes. But also to radio. Newspapers were very inhospitable to radio coming along the line and said people don't learn from their ears, they only learn from their eyes. And radio was kept out of the news business at first. The Biltmore Agreement said that radio stations could not have more than 2 news updates a day. Your life would be very different. And they couldn't have advertising, couldn't be supported because newspapers are jerks, and that's what they did. Then it came along with film, and the Chicago Tribune said that Nickelodeon should be banned for children under 18. Sound familiar? Just what happened in Australia with people under 16. Then Senate hearings about juvenile delinquency, and the first cause was comic books, and then it was television, then video games, rock lyrics, and now here we are with the internet. So yes, it's a story that's been played over and over and over again. The script is familiar. Media have amnesia about doing this over and over again. But what's different this time is that I think that media, in their panic, see the internet as an existential threat to their own business. And so they're a little nastier this time.
When you say media, it's not a monolith. Is it really an existential threat?
No, I don't think so at all. I think that my frustration being in our business and having been a newspaper executive and magazine founder is that we should have done a much better job of making the internet our own. And we treated it as a threat. We treated ourselves as the victim of it. But that's, I think, mainly true of big, old, institutional, incumbent media. I see a wonderful growth. We were talking about it backstage, of right here in San Francisco. When I worked at the Examiner back in the day, when it was still a newspaper, kind of, and the media scene in San Francisco was pretty awful. And right now, as you've said, it's vibrant. It has all kinds of things, from Berkeley side to SF Standard, because of the internet. And so that's where I'm excited. That's where there's doing more. So you're right. Media is not monolithic, but old monopoly, monolithic media, I think is what's going to die.
You write, some in Silicon Valley fancy themselves thought leaders. And I thought you might go into that about it, because we seem to be in a media landscape now where things like podcasts and celebrity influencers and people who can dance the news or at least report from their mother's basement, and oftentimes I would say not credibly so, but the people who are watching them, who are paying attention, don't care about those old legacy markers of credibility. I'm not sure that it's better or that it's been replaced with something that's better all the time. Berkeley side and the SF Standard notwithstanding, there's also a lot of, this is a family-friendly program. There's a lot of poo-poo out there.
Yeah, there is more chaff, but there's also more wheat. And what I celebrate most about the internet is that it has enabled voices who were always there, but were not heard, to now have the microphone and now have the stage. And that's what the people who controlled the microphone and the stage resent. And those are I'm old enough, and I think maybe one or two in the audience might be old enough to remember Walter Cronkite. And he would end every broadcast saying, and that's the way it is. But for many Americans, it wasn't the way it was. If you were Black, Latino, immigrant, LGBTQ, disabled, and so on, a view of America was presented that wasn't you. And so what I celebrated about the internet is that these voices can now be heard. Again, they were always there. They're not given voice. They always had the voice. And I think that's important. But to your next question about credibility and how we manage that, I went down a delightful, for me, rabbit hole in this book, where I wanted to see what people did before print. My last book that I discussed here is called The Gutenberg Parenthesis. And I examined the age of media from Gutenberg on. And so I looked back and I found this wonderful concept called fama, which in Latin, I am told, I didn't go to that kind of school where I learned Latin, but I'm told it means it is said. And fama is about a social system of credibility that if you talk to the innkeeper and the innkeeper talks to everyone coming through town and the innkeeper usually gets things right, the innkeeper has good fama, has a good reputation. The opposite of good fama is infamy, is something that's unreliable. And people had to manage their fama, whether they were the source of information or the subject of information or the spreader of information or the recipient of it. There was a social system that existed then because we didn't have anything else. And when print came along, print was not trusted because the provenance was not clear. Anybody could make this printed thing. Anybody can make a blog post. But the innkeeper, he knows his stuff. And so I think we find ourselves in this moment of disruption where on the one hand, I celebrate that there are so many voices, so many more lived experiences that we can now join in, so many more perspectives, so many more witnesses to things, but also so many more jerks and malign characters and people who want to manipulate us. And so we're in a very difficult time, I think, before we can try to figure this out about how we manage this as a society.
Couple of things. One, I think it would be a mistake to believe that ethnic newspapers or magazines started with the internet.
Yes.
Right.
Absolutely true.
Especially here in San Francisco, where amazing stuff happening in the Black community, Chinese language newspapers.
Absolutely. Well, in fact,
Yeah.
I was commissioned by the California Chamber of Commerce to write a paper about the California Journalism Preservation Act and everything that came around from that. And one thing that I learned in that process, so the original bill, which didn't pass, instead Google negotiated a deal with the state, but the original bill was going to reward links. It was a link tax. Well, when I talked to Black media in the state, they said much of our media is still newspapers in print. We wouldn't have benefited at all from that. And you're right, the history is also forgotten.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think initially, certainly my hope, and I imagine many historians of all stripes, was with the advent of the internet, we would all have access to all that archival material, and we do. But yes and no, right? Like if you don't know that it's there, you might not seek it out. If it's not findable amidst the oceans of dreck that is findable, you might not ever come in contact with it. So a little story, I cover wildfires, have for, I don't know, 25 years now?
We're having those in New Jersey now, too.
Yes. Welcome. Come on in. The
Welcome to
water's
your
not
life.
fine, but yeah. One of the things I've noticed is, with the advent of Twitter, now X,
I won't call
may
it
Twitter
X. I refuse
rest
to
in
call it
peace.
X. It's still Twitter.
Whatever. It's a dumpster fire now. But, in the beginning, one of the things I would notice when I would, go on Twitter to report about various things about wildfires, like it's coming over this hill, and the evacuation orders are in place for these communities, and I was there at the command center issuing these little sort of baby reports, and that was kind of a fun thing to do, to be faster, briefer, to the minute. Boy, there's no community service journalism like covering a natural disaster where people are depending on you for credible information in a timely fashion. And sometimes I would find local neighborhood people, maybe they were they didn't have a full-time job in journalism, but they used to, or they were just, really credible people who, had a camera with them, taking photography, and they would provide stuff. But then there would also be these people who were reading the news off the internet and wanting the glory of being somebody to give out information, but unable to tell that they were sharing information that was old or inaccurate, and that stuff began to drown out the credible stuff from the professionals and the amateurs alike. And I think that kind of describes what a lot of people have experienced, not just on that platform, but on many platforms.
Yes. I think back to the pandemic, not that we're not out of it, we're still there. And normally I would be wearing a mask too, to the folks in the audience who are wearing them. But we think back to the early days of it when we didn't know what was going on. And I found myself following a lot of doctors, biologists, virologists, epidemiologists online. And I made a COVID Twitter list where I went to some effort to verify their credentials and read their feeds to see that they weren't crazy, and asked people who I did trust who was trustworthy. And I came up with a list of 600 people. And Twitter, the good Twitter at the time, came to me and asked me to help verify people so that people would know that these were verified experts. And I found it fascinating that science adapted to the reality of the internet more than our business in journalism. They've always had, since Cicero, they've had peer review. And they've published papers in peer review, but that took too much time. So they used preprint servers to get information out there, and then they used Twitter to do peer review. I found a paper would come out, and in 3 hours, I would see experts reviewing the paper, and it would see it in public. These experts would talk to people like me, and I would make videos with them, and they would answer people's questions, and they would answer journalists' questions. And so there's, without question, a good use of this medium. The problem again comes that the responsibility falls to each of us now to decide what is reliable and what isn't. And we're out of practice, I think. A lot of talk goes into the idea of media literacy or news literacy. I'm not fond of that because I think that if news needs a user's manual, we're doing it wrong.
And most people don't have 8 hours a day to spend, carefully determining.
Right. But I do think that we have to come along and decide who is credible. A quick story from the Gutenberg age. The first alleged call for censorship in the age of print came in 1470 when a Latin scholar named Niccolo Perotti was much offended by a shoddy translation of Pliny. And he wrote to the Pope and said, something must be done. Sound familiar? And you must appoint a censor to review everything before it comes off the press in Rome, as naive as that was. And as I thought about it, I realized that Perotti was not, in fact, seeking censorship. What he was doing was anticipating the creation of the institutions of editing and publishing that would soon follow, and that worked very well for centuries. But those institutions we're finding inadequate to the scale of speech today. So the question then becomes, what new institutions do we need to create, or how do we need to update the institutions we have? How might news change? I mean, it's what you did on the front of the fire line, is you were also trying to determine for the audience who was credible and who was not. You couldn't be at all the places. Their photos and their reports were valuable, but you had the job of FAMA on behalf of us all to try to take the value of that information from this public medium and share it. So that's an institutional answer to the problem we have.
But there's also this thing, right, where so I'm a public media journalist. I am paid, in fact, by the listeners, by the readers of the information I deliver, to go out on their behalf and do the news. And, one way or another, there has to be some kind of financial structure in place to allow for that to happen. Or you get somebody who you can't trust precisely because their financial well-being doesn't depend on them doing a good job for you.
Yeah, the business model is most uncertain. I ran a center for entrepreneurial journalism. I taught journalists the business of journalism so they can be proper stewards, and there's no easy answer for this. What I do think is happening is that we're coming to the end of the arc of mass media. And I think that mass media as this, and I think it was a temporary phenomenon. It was from the late 19th century when the mechanization and industrialization of print, a technology story, went from the average circulation of a daily newspaper in the US before that was 4,000. It was a Substack newsletter. But then when mechanization came along, obviously scale came. And with it came a business model that was pretty good because if you could afford to buy the press and buy your ink by the barrel, you had a good business. But now there's much competition. And so the fundamental economics of media have changed in a way that hasn't settled out yet. The other problem is that we're still in a case on the internet of using media's old business model, the attention economy. You remember that story from BuzzFeed a few years ago about the two-colored dress? Is it this color or that color? Everybody saw it differently. And it was a cute story in BuzzFeed. I would go to journalism conferences like this, and I would ask the people in the room, how many of your outlets had that exact same story? And every hand would go up. Not because they ran it off the Associated Press, because they rewrote it. It was a tremendous waste of journalistic effort. But they did it because of the business model, because they had to have their own page with their own content to get their own likes and SEO and clicks, to get their own ad and their own pennies from it. And we're terribly inefficient in that way because we're still following that old model. And the question becomes, in a world this confusing, how do you build a news and media brand that's built around trust and value in people's lives? And I think you do that in public media. I think a lot of the for-profit media right now today is struggling to figure out how to do that.
So do you consider yourself a techno-optimist then? Do you think it's all going to come out in the wash?
I always say that the most ridiculous job title on earth is futurist. So I don't predict, I don't know. My point is it could go either way. And we would be wise to study history, not for parallels, not for it repeating itself, but simply for the lessons, simply to see what went on before, with print, with radio, with television. And this is very different, but there are still lessons to be learned from this transition, from this change. I like the internet. I think I'm very lucky to live in this time of the internet. I'm fortunate. I lived on a watershed of technology in our business. I lived when type was still being set in lead by linotypes, which is the subject of my next book, in newspapers. And then I saw that technology change and how type was set. And then along came computers and personal computers. Then they were connected. And now where we are today. So I've seen this incredible arc, and I'm grateful for the internet. Right? In the early days of the pandemic, we would have been screwed without it. It has brought me friends, people right here because of the podcasts I'm on. It brings me information constantly. It brings me joy. I love the internet. And that's why I wanted to write this book, was to defend its freedoms, not necessarily its corporations. But we can absolutely screw this up. Look at Twitter. Look at what happened there. I loved my blog, buzzmachine.com, that I started writing after the World Trade Center attack. And I kind of abused it when Twitter came along, right? It was squirrel, and I could now write whatever I thought it, and I'd find myself in conversation, and my blog became like the first child when you've had two more, right? And I regret that because I wish I had supported open source blogging more, rather than finding some portion of my contribution, for what it's worth, to public discourse in a place that could be taken over by a nihilistic narcissist named Musk. And so I think that I made mistakes along the way. I was too optimistic. I, like the technology companies in Silicon Valley, I don't think I fully saw how malign actors could use the weaknesses of the internet. I didn't support these open standards enough. I went with the corporations, and we needed the corporations to do a lot of good things, but we also needed to support that essence of the internet. So I am an optimist to the extent that I know it's possible that we could continue to do great things with it, but we could also screw it up.
And, it's interesting that we're talking so much about, X, nay, Twitter, precisely because it is such a dramatic example of a collapse of a platform that a lot of people loved when it worked. But there's an example of, basically a gazillionaire demagogue taking it over and using it for his own purposes and running it into the ground. And I guess what I'm trying to say is it's 2024. It's not 2004. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, after reading this book, whether you're fighting the demons of the past, but the landscape has changed, and the fight has changed, and the things we should be worried about have changed.
Yes and no. Some things that existed from 2004 on are still valuable. I have not left Twitter yet, and people get mad at me for that, and they scold me for that. But it's very easy for me to leave to go to Blue Sky, which I love. I'm on everywhere. I'm on Threads, and I'm everywhere. As an individual, that's not hard. But communities still exist on Twitter that I value. I had the privilege about a year ago of playing host to 4 scholars of Black Twitter, and we held a Black Twitter summit after Musk bought it. And what became clear is a lot was built with Black Twitter. And that's not easy to move. That's a community with its affordances and its norms and its history, and it's still there. And so, no, I don't think that everything changes completely. We need to respect that history and not gentrify it and not have a white flight off of Twitter. Yes, things change with AI, which I assume we'll get to as well. But that doesn't mean that the internet is gone. It doesn't mean that search is gone. The issues you talked about of discovery are still there. They change that now that we have chat and soon agents. But no, I don't think it changes that radically. One lesson I learned in studying the arc of the story of Gutenberg and print is that it took a half a century before the book as we know it took on the form we know. It took a century and a half after Gutenberg before we saw tremendous innovation with print, the creation of the modern novel with Cervantes, of the essay with Montaigne, of a market for printed plays with Shakespeare, and the newspaper, the invention of the newspaper, came a century and a half afterwards. It took that long before the technology got boring. And people said, well, what can we do with the technology? The business model didn't come for another century, until 1710 and copyright. The technology didn't change for another century until the 1800s. So I think there's this sense that, the internet's done. It's finished now. We know what it is. Let's regulate it. Let's fix it up. Or it's a mess and it can't be fixed. That I don't believe. I think that we are only at the beginning to imagine what it is. And we always see the future in the analog of the past. Marshall McLuhan said that new media are filled by the content of old media. And that's what's happened so far with the internet. The only thing on the internet that I think is wholly new, in my view, is TikTok. Because it's collaborative. Because it's a different way that we interact with each other. And so that's a bare beginning of what the internet might become.
But I'm going to push back here a little bit, because with all of these platforms, TikTok going all the way back, there are, at least on the internet, we're talking about algorithms. And the way that the different platforms use algorithms has substantially changed. I don't think I'm alone in having the experience where once I might have been able to, be exposed to the things I wanted to be exposed to having to dig for them, to, having to be a stalker on someone's page to find out the new update instead of having it come to me because I'm swimming through all kinds of advertised content that I don't want.
Well, if I swim through a news site, I also swim through a lot of advertising content, by the way.
It's
We
much
do that
less
too.
obtrusive. And
Depends on the site.
yeah, obviously, maybe I'm not, visiting the worst actors.
Right.
But I will say, like my experience of, like you, I'm on multiple sites. So whether it's Facebook or Instagram or X, not Blue Sky yet, I'm hoping, right? LinkedIn. Oh my gosh, it's just so unpleasant.
So I hear this complaints about the algorithm often as if it's kind of a beast out there doing something to us. But if you go to Facebook and turn off the algorithm, which you can do, and you can get the chronological, it's worse. There's a lot of junk in that.
Well, a
There's
lot of people have
saying
left
things.
already.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's not to say that there aren't influences that I regret. Look at what's happening with Meta on all three of its platforms now, is they've downgraded both news and links. Musk is downgrading links. Well, that's how we talk with news. That's how we get out. I love Blue Sky.
And that's existential for the news business.
Yes, but the news business has also been a jerk to Silicon Valley and been entitled. And what we saw play out in Canada, where they had a law demanding that the platforms pay, Meta said, then we're out. And so Meta got rid of news from all of its platforms in Canada. And the news industry had said, how dare you steal our headlines? That's all the value. You're robbing us of our souls. How can you do this? You must pay us for this. Well, what happened after Meta pulled all the news from Instagram, Facebook, and Threads in Canada was that they didn't lose any traffic. But the news sites lost 50 to 70% of their traffic. So be careful what you lobby for. Because what the market said was the links are more valuable than the headlines. And so I think we've got to recognize that's where we are in the world today, and it's going to get worse. For the first century and a half of mass media news, we were in a destination strategy. You had to come to us to buy our paper at the kiosk or come to our frequency on the radio to get the news, right? Then we had search and we had SEO, search engine optimization. That's how we got discovered. Then we had social and audience development. That's how we got discovered. Now we have chat. There's an entire new industry, I saw this the other day, that is now called GEO, not SEO, generative engine optimization. And next we're going to have agents. And so how do we make news discoverable in that world of chat and generative AI and agents? That's going to be very complicated. And the reflex in the news industry is to treat themselves as the victims of the technology and to say, you're screwing us over and how dare you do this again, having not learned the lesson. There's a different way that I've seen in the Nordics. In Norway, Schibsted, which is a brilliant media company there, arranged to have all the publishers in Norway contribute their content, business model later, but contribute their content to an experiment with a university to build a Norwegian language LLM. And it works very well. And they came together as a force of media and said, we're going to act together. What's happening in the US right now is the New York Times is suing OpenAI, or the big moguls, Murdoch, or in Germany, Springer, or here, Barry Diller, are going to OpenAI and company and saying, give us a bag of money. And they're getting their money, and then they're walking away. And the vast ecosystem of news, all those sites you just started to mention about what's here in the Bay Area, get left out of that. It's the moguls who are taking the bucks and walking away and not caring about anybody else. That hurts the rest of the news ecosystem. It hurts the public. It doesn't really serve the AI companies because they're not really licensing content. They're just paying money off so that they don't get lobbied or sued. What would happen if the news industry in the US ganged together and said, let's create an API for news, a path to use the news? What if we went to the AI companies and said, listen, you want current content? Okay, here's the deal. Let's talk about money. Let's talk about links. Let's talk about brand. Let's talk about credit. Let's talk about how you use it. I think that could be an effective conversation. The problem is that I know well from having spent 50 years in the news business, we never get along. We'll never do that.
It's like herding cats.
Rats, I'd say.
Herding rats. I think you just coined a phrase.
Yeah, I like it. Yeah. Trademark.
Well, speaking of trademarked verbiage, I don't know if you saw Shira Ovaday's latest column in the Washington Post. I wanted to read a little bit from the top. The Oxford English Dictionary blew it in anointing brain rot as the word of the year. First off, that's 2 words, but the real miss was overlooking the rightful winner, slop, which was on the dictionary publisher's shortlist for the word of the year. What's your read on generative AI? Is it coming to save us from ourselves, destroy our will to live, something in between?
Generative AI fascinates me because the machine is now literate. The machine can talk to us and we can talk to it in our language, and we can tell it in our language, in our human languages, what to do. I never became a coder, but now I can tell the machine without code to do something. That's pretty powerful. So it's AI's been around. Google's been using AI in all kinds of ways. When we got spell check or maps or ads or anything, AI's been there. What changed 2 years ago with ChatGPT was you suddenly said, oh, hell, this thing can talk to us and understand us. And that is pretty awesome, especially as writers, as journalists. It's sobering. It's a really neat tool. It's, in some measure, a parlor trick. I have a lot of beliefs about this. One is that it should not be used to write news stories because it does not know, it doesn't hallucinate, it doesn't know what a fact is. It has no sense of meaning. We shouldn't put it near meaning. I also don't think we should use it right now around search engines yet until we know more about it. However, there's all kinds of neat uses we can put it to. I took that entire manuscript and I put it into Notebook LM, a product from Google, and you might have heard this, when it was the buzz about a month ago. It produced an 8-minute podcast, eliminating what we're doing right now.
Yeah.
It was actually pretty good.
I beg to differ, right? There was one gal who was basically summarizing what you were saying, and then there was another guy who was going, yeah, exactly, totally, yeah, yeah.
Well, it's like AM radio,
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
NPR. And it can summarize these. We could have, there's a wonderful program called The Documenters, which is starting to come in California, where imagine if we recorded 100 school board meetings across the state, and we got a queryable database to say which ones of them are banning books or are being horrible to trans children, which ones are doing other things. That's something we couldn't have done as journalists. There's all kinds of uses we can put this to. And I think we need a sane discussion about that. I often quote the paper by Timnit Gebru and 3 other authors, got them, 2 of them ousted from Google, the Stochastic Parrots paper, which talked about the current present tense issues around AI, around environment, around labor, around bias, and so on. The problem is that the AI boys, and they're mainly boys, are trying to argue that they are all powerful. They are the Wizards of Oz. And that they're going to create something they call artificial general intelligence, that it's going to be smarter than us. And it's just around the corner. It's always just around the corner. AGI is another way to say BS. I don't think that's the case. Jan LeCun, who is the head of AI at Meta, says that at most, right now, AI is as smart as a dumb cat. And cat lovers may think that's even going too high. I'm a cat lover too, it's okay. But they're insisting that they're going to have this superpower. And what they're saying to policymakers is, we could destroy mankind. They talk about doomers and X-risk and all of this. They follow a set of philosophies, including transhumanism, effective altruism, long-termism. They talk about having an obligation to the 10 to the 54th real and virtual human beings of the future, and that's what matters. And the problems today are really nothing. And it's their way to say, give us all the money and give us the future. That scares me.
Without regulating them.
Well, anyway, it's also a means of regulatory capture, right? Because Musk's ear is at the White House right now saying, I am the all-powerful Oz of AI. And Zuckerberg's going to do the same thing and so on. And so what scares me is not the technology, it's the technologists in this case. And I think that we've got to judge them harshly. We've got to put journalism to them. We've got to report on these cult-like philosophies that they have. Timnit Gebru and Emil Torres cover this a lot. If you want to Google this, Google TESCREAL, TESCREAL. That's an acronym for these various philosophies, and you'll be going down a rat hole of what they believe in. But that's not the conversation we hear in much media coverage of AI. The Washington, when a guy at Google thought that their AI was sentient, the Washington Post just kind of gobbled that up because it made a good story. Kevin Roose at the New York Times said that ChatGPT fell in love with him and was trying to break up his marriage. BS. It's a machine. It's a word prediction machine. We should stop calling it artificial intelligence. It's a word predictor. And as that, it's pretty amazing. It's a concordance of all of the content it can get its hands on from the past. That's pretty interesting. That's worthwhile. But it's not a new form of intelligence.
But here again, I'll push back. I read an awful lot of tech press in an awful lot of publications, including the Washington Post and the New York Times. And they have a lot of reporters, and some of them don't get it right, but a lot of them do.
Some do. I
Yeah.
wouldn't know that I'd go so far as saying a lot.
You know, it depends. Everyone's always looking for that fun, sticky story that's going to get people to click because it's clickbait. But you
Which
know,
is the basis of moral panic, where we started.
yeah.
Right? It's can we make this awesome and scary at the same time?
But you know, same thing with California lawmakers, which is kind of my, I guess, major beat these days, is like following California's attempts to legislate and regulate. And sure, there are people like Scott Wiener who are looking at catastrophic issues, and he's not picking those ideas out of nowhere. He is going to experts and talking to them, including people at Amazon, owned Anthropic, right? Like
But Anthropic is one of the great believers in AGI.
well,
So we've got
for
to
sure.
look at what they say in that context to
Yeah.
say that they're pumping this so they can get venture money.
They're talking out of both sides of their mouth. This thing is the second coming, but also, let's focus on the small quotidian issues. But also, look the other way as we exacerbate climate change and completely gut over a century of copyright law and, destroy the livelihoods of countless creatives in multiple industries.
One of the great paradoxes of this, I think, is that when a technology comes along, the technologists are in charge, right? With print, it was a technology. Then it just became a job to be done. You hired a printer to do this. What was more interesting was the higher level functions. Same with radio, same with other technologies. The great paradox of generative AI is that it replaces the technologists to a great extent. Not fully, but the fact that you can have the computer do things without code takes away a lot of work. Jensen Huang, the head of NVIDIA, has said out loud that schools should stop training computer scientists. Now, I'm not sure that's true, but it's a bold statement that says something. English, and AI Inside, the podcast I do with Jason Howell, we interviewed an executive who said that the most powerful programming language on planet Earth today is English. And we hope other languages like Norwegian as well. And so that changes, that I think speeds up this idea that we fire the geeks, that they fall into the background, and the creators
How
do
do
more.
you know? How do you know that something is right or wrong unless you already know? So here's an example, right? Like obviously Boeing engineers did not need generative AI to make planes fall from the sky, but I can see so many situations where the fact that you have somebody who is not trained in the innards, what's under the hood, can't tell that what they're looking at is, not correct.
This is why I'm working with two universities new to me, Stony Brook University and Montclair State University. And in both cases, I hope to help with programs to do new programs in AI and technology and society. And what that amounts to is to bring in other disciplines. We need to have the future. Our students today need to be the leaders of the society that's going to use AI, and they need to have a grounding in ethics and history and anthropology and community studies and design and other disciplines, that it's not purely a technology. That's what I really said about the internet in this book, is that it's not fundamentally a technological enterprise. It is a human enterprise. What's good and bad about the internet is us. It's paraphrasing Pogo. We have met the internet and it is us. And AI is different because it's more technological, it's more amazing, but in the end, we as humans are going to decide how to use it. And so we need to equip the next generation, I think, in these greater skills than just technology.
So let's imagine that, Trump calls you to Mar-a-Lago and says, Right. I'm talking to a lot of people. So many people want to talk to me. But I want to talk to you.
That's a straight line that it's hard to touch.
Some might argue.
I'm not Joe. Who do you think I am? Joe Scarborough? Sorry.
He's clearly got a case of recency bias, right? So maybe
yes.
you'd be in a
Well said,
position
yes.
to, influence the direction of things over the next 4 years. What would you advise him?
Quit. But I would advise anyone in that world to value, not attack, expertise and education. That's what we're seeing. My theory about the internet and its role in our current societal tsuris is, as I said earlier, communities that didn't have the microphone now have the microphone, and those who held the microphone resent that. Print, I'm not a technological determinist. Technologies don't cause things. It's how we use them. But print did open the door to Martin Luther and the Reformation and then the Counter-Reformation. And my theory is that we might look back and see that Black Lives Matter was the racial reformation in this country made possible by communities being able to gather and speak together online and organize together. And the Counter-Reformation was January 6th and was this election. And there's an amazing shift that's occurring right now that I wrote about in the Gutenberg parenthesis, where conservatives used to be those who conserved institutions, who protected the past from progressives' view of change. That is exactly flipped 180 degrees now, where it is these so-called conservatives, the right, who are destroying institutions, whether that is the institutions of government or science or medicine or whatever it may be. And so now the progressives are in the position where they have to defend the institutions they would have changed. And what does it mean to defend an institution today? I think it still means to help it change, to help it do these things. But our world is greatly altered by this. The only solution, I think, to the societal tsuris we're in today is education. But that's just what's being attacked. And so I don't know how we get around that. How do we use journalism? How do we use the internet? How do we use what we have at our hand to better educate the public? When people say crazy stuff, I don't think that they necessarily believe it. I think it's a loyalty test. I think it's a signal of belonging. I've been rereading Hannah Arendt and the Origins of Totalitarianism. And I'm hoping the plane on the way back, I'll start writing a post about Arendt for journalists. Because we got to look at that history and understand that. And the internet has a huge role in this, because we look at the internet and we say, oh my God, it's making everybody hate. No, we brought our hate online. It's making facts irrelevant. No, people are choosing not to use facts because they'd rather have a fiction that they want to believe in. And the internet is absolutely used as a device to spread that and to organize that. But it's also going to be a device for us to do the opposite. And so we've got to figure out how to use it well.
Gosh, I wish I could be optimistic about that. The chances of that happening.
I know, I'm not predicting that it will, but I am saying that this is our obligation, is that everything we do on the internet as individuals is putting a brick into the future of that internet and building that wall. In one of my earlier books, I wrote about what I call the Cabernet rule, which is never go online when you've had too many glasses of Cabernet, but I found the loophole, which is called Pinot Noir. And so I would go online and I would say jerky things to people, and I regret that, right? And that was the internet that I was building. And so, at a personal responsibility, at the end of the book, I argue that we have to sign on to covenants of mutual obligation. And so I should be able to say to friends of mine online, this is what you should expect of me. And when I don't meet that standard, you should call me on it. But the same thing should happen with media and technologists and technology companies and platforms. When Meta releases its terms of service, it is obligating its customers, but never itself. What do we hold Meta accountable for? One of my complaints about Facebook from the beginning, now Facebook's done some amazing things in the day, I'm less enthused today, but I think it's been interesting in the past, is it never had a North Star. It never said, here's what we're here to do together. It's just the everything machine. And it got bad enough, but then Twitter, X now, is really the anything and everything machine. And it has no North Star, or if it does, it's down in the deep earth.
Yeah, but it's also a train wreck. I mean, like,
Yeah.
it never could never compete with Meta in terms of like numbers and audience.
But it was still a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
And I mourn what has happened to it. Now, mind you, and blocking doesn't matter now because Musk got rid of that, which is really the worst thing he's done, I think, on Meta, on Twitter. But I still have people I value there. I still have a pretty good feed. I still actually like it. I like Blue Sky a lot more, but I think that there are good people online. The problem is we tend to look. I'm doing the opposite of the usual. We don't see the trees for the forest. We think of Meta as a company we may not like. But on Meta platforms are lots of people I do like, and we have to keep that in mind.
I have a bunch of questions here, and I want to encourage all of you in the audience here in person, in the audience online, to add more questions to the mix.
Or arguments. Or
arguments, yeah. You're full
or
of
challenges.
Challenges, welcome. I did want to ask one last question before I dive into these, which is, you mentioned earlier that, you've been to provide counsel to media companies, to tech companies. You've even been a bit of an angel investor. Am I right? A couple of ventures?
Please don't bring that up. A few things I did that were very bad.
You've dabbled.
I dabbled.
But I'm more interested in those sort of site visits. Do you get a sense, whether it's the media companies or the tech companies, that they understand what they're looking at in terms of the problems of the day, and that they're marshaling their resources in an effective way to meet the challenge?
That's a really, really good and important question. After the 2016 election, I, among many, got calls from people at Google and at Facebook kind of saying, well, what do you think we should do? And they and I'll throw myself into this, were taken aback by how the internet was used and what impact it might have had. I raised a lot of money to support disinformation campaigns or campaigns against disinformation, but I'm not sure that's the right thing now. I think that was even wrong. I think we thought that we in journalism think that if the problem is disinformation and we're in the information business, we're the solution. But again, as I said before, I think people say things because they want to signal their belonging to something. And I wonder about how to create a journalism of belonging. And I argued a long time ago that if Facebook were to have a North Star, which I wish it had, the one I would like it to have is to make strangers less strange, because otherness is what is exploited. I would say the same mission should stand for journalism, that we should make strangers less strange. But what's happened, this is something I haven't written yet, I'm trying to think how to write it. I see kind of a crisis in judgment. Nobody wants to make judgments. Journalists don't want to judge candidates. They don't want to judge movements. They don't want to judge voters. Social media companies don't want to judge what people have to say, because to do so is very expensive, very controversial, and right now politically very risky. And so what we have is that the internet and media have become altogether the everything machine where everything is. And as you said earlier, when it just came, it's hard to find credible news about something. It's hard to find good people and good creativity and other things. So I go back to Niccolo Perotti, that peeved Latin scholar in 1470. What are the institutions that we create? Where are the opportunities to help find the good stuff, help find the interesting people? And it's not going to be one size fits all. It's not going to be mass anymore. You have different interests than I have. But we need help to find the good stuff. And podcasts, I think, are one way. I'm also on This Week in Google, and we talk about that every week. I think that Blue Sky enables you to come up with lists of people, starter kits. That's a way that we can all share who we think we are. It goes back to the days of blogging and blog rolls when we shared that, which was really kind of cool. We have to start developing those institutions, I think. And it's not going to happen from the top down. It's not going to happen from the platforms. They don't know how to do this. They're scared of making judgments. We have to.
This person asks, how do you distinguish between, or how do you disincentivize moral panic and encourage right-sized reactions to new ideas and technologies?
That's a good question, which as a professor is how we try to buy time to find an answer. I think that the problem remains the attention economy. And I'm not saying that advertising is evil and capitalism is evil. We need to support journalism, and advertising is one way we're going to do it. But the way it's set up now is we're in a mad rush to get clicks. And we invented that in media. You know, I worked for the New York Daily News. It was a tabloid. We invented big headlines in media. So I think we have to have a media ecosystem that's built on the value we bring to people's lives. And that should include saying to media, stop wasting my time with all this panic crap. I don't know how we get from here to there, but I think that's where media have to go.
How do you stay optimistic and hopeful for the future of the internet when the world feels increasingly less sympathetic and more hostile to discussion and debate?
So my big changing moment online and in life came after, as I mentioned earlier, I survived the attack on the World Trade Center on 9/11. And that's when I started blogging. And I thought I would do it for a week or two. I had more things to say. I had written my story from being there. And my friend Nick Denton, who founded Gawker Media, took something I'd written and sent it to a blogger he knew in LA, and the blogger in LA wrote something about it and linked to me, and then I wrote back and I linked to him. And that was a moment in life when I realized that what was occurring was a conversation happening in different times in different places, and that properly conceived media should be a conversation. And that's rather trite to say. There are scholars like James Carey, who wrote about that their entire academic career. But I had that realization moment, and that's been what I've been all about since. I started a program with my colleague Carrie Brown in engagement journalism, which is all about teaching journalists to listen. It's all about conversation. And I thought that maybe Gutenberg had ruined that. He freeze-dried conversation onto a page. But I saw that the early days of print were very conversational. Erasmus and Sir Thomas More sent each other letters to include in their books, and an open conversation. The first epistolary novels were revised with more conversation from the public. Martin Luther and the Pope conversed in their books and burnings of them, right? What changed was the mechanization and industrialization of print with scale, and that took it away. What the internet does, I think, is it brings back conversation, and we're out of practice. We're bad at it as a society. But I do think we can learn how to do it again. I do think it's possible. So that comes back to this notion of a covenant and the bricks that we each use when we build the internet. It means that the next time you see something that's too good to be true, stop. Check it out first. The next time you really want to say, oh, screw off, you jerk, maybe you don't say that. The next time you want to say, oh, look at the fight over there, maybe you don't. And that's tiny, and that's no big solution. But how else do we as a society establish our norms, but a person and a moment at a time?
Is there a good outcome from platforms serving us more and more of what we want and like at the expense of exposure to counter narratives and ideas? Can AI help us take our medicine with all the sugar? It's a great question.
That is. The internet is often accused of creating filter bubbles and echo chambers. If you're interested in this, I recommend a book by Axel Bruns called Are Filter Bubbles Real? And his answer to TLDR is no, they're not. And much of the research says that's not the case. There's a political psychologist, social psychologist I quote in the book named Michael Bong Peterson from Denmark. And he says that paradoxically, the internet does the opposite of what we think. We think it puts us in filter bubbles, and he says no. What really happens is we live in filter bubbles in our so-called real life, and the internet exposes us to people and ideas that we don't like or we fear or we're unfamiliar with. And it bursts our bubbles. And there's another great book from years ago called The Big Sort, which was about Americans who were moving to networks of sameness.
Homogenous, yeah.
Yeah. That's happening again. I just saw a story in the Times of the Post a week or two ago where people are moving from purple places to red or blue places, and we're sorting ourselves. The internet slams us together. And right now we don't know what to do with that, and we're uncomfortable with that. But we actually are more exposed. So now to the question about AI, which is interesting. I think there is an opportunity to question AI in your own privacy and without embarrassment. Well, part of the problems with education and journalism is that it can be embarrassing. It's embarrassing to be wrong. It's embarrassing to not know. It's embarrassing even to learn, which we shouldn't have as a society, but we do. You're sitting alone with an AI chat. Maybe you're not embarrassed to ask a stupid question. Let's hope it comes back with the right answer. It might not. And because of the randomness of AI, you ask the question today, you get the same question tomorrow, you'll probably get a different answer. So there's issues there, and I don't think technology is generally not the solution to anything. We are. But it's an interesting question about how you can do things in private. When reading became silent before print, it became a private activity. Reading was someone standing up in front of a room and reading the book, because we only had one book because they were damned expensive, because they were written by hand, took forever, right? And when print came along and made it cheaper, people could read their own books in quiet. And that suddenly made it a private activity. It led to, by the way, pornography. Because if you weren't going to do it out loud, but hey, what the hell, it's written here, I can do what I want to do, right? So that's an interesting question I never thought of before. But what does AI and the chat interface, the fact that it's a literate machine, enable us to do in private? That can be bad, but it can also be interesting and good.
Well, we keep talking about text, but AI is also moving into the video space.
Yes.
And the audio space, but that's neither here nor there. I don't know. My biggest fear with generative AI is not planes falling from the sky per se, or manufactured virus causing another global pandemic.
God help us.
But really, or an epidemic of cheating in schools. It's really this idea of the text apocalypse. That's, well, I'm using the word text again. But this sort of feedback loop of like blah blah going back and forth, so that it becomes harder and harder for the individual to find quality information of any kind.
It's worse than that, I think. So textpocalypse is something coined by my friend Matthew Kirschenbaum, who's a brilliant professor at University of Maryland. He's writing a book on this now. He if you want to look it up, look up at The Atlantic. He wrote about what happens when the machine feeds on its own entrails until we end up with a gray goo of text. What's happening, Rachel, I think, is it's worse than that, to the extent that AI is already ruining the web. People are complaining. I'm curious what you think about this. People say that Google is worse today than it was a few years ago. First question is, do you think that's the case? Do you sense that Google's worse?
I think it dipped, and I think it's coming back.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
What makes it come back? Is it the AI helping it come back? Is it the top of the screen answer?
Yeah, initially, the way Google AI was working seemed horrific, like it was summarizing from non-credible sources, bearing a lot of the links that would take you to really the most credible answers. And after all, how was Google built in the first place? By taking you to credible links. Right. And, we all know that very few people have the level of interest or the time to go clicking past page 1, maybe 2. Actually, my partner was showing me this the other day, that like now you get the way things are visually laid out. There is the short answer for people who want it, but there is also lots of other resources displayed in an inviting way to encourage you to dig deeper and learn more about what it is you're asking about.
I'm glad to hear you say that, because I wasn't sure where it stands. I hear frustration about the search, and of course there's many competitors for search now, TikTok, Amazon, and so on. What I do think, however, is the web is getting loaded with AI crap.
Yeah.
And that's going to be injurious, not just to Google, but I think to everything. And then we come back to this question of judgment. I don't want it to search all that junk. I want it to make judgments. I want it to find the good stuff. And that's going to be harder and harder, I think, to do in the text apocalypse.
And it's not just AI-generated stuff. AI in some ways is the gun that people use to kill people. But the other issue that we haven't talked about at all this evening is advertising. And you rail in the book against the concept of the ad surveillance economy. But I really think that's possibly done more than anything, including generative AI, to ruin the internet as an experience for consumers, from a national security perspective, data privacy. We're all, not just us, but also the most vulnerable people in our lives, are constantly facing an onslaught of hacking, and companies can't keep up. And they collect our data and then they sell it on, no matter how sensitive it is. Health data, social security data, it's all out there on the web. They don't have the resources, or perhaps they're not putting enough money into the resources to keep that data that is ours secure, so it gets hacked. Malevolent actors are coming at us using AI to sift through all the stuff so that they can target us in a more effective manner. I mean,
We'll agree to an extent there.
yeah.
I think that, as I say, the attention economy that was invented in 1893 with a magazine called Munsey's, when they sold the magazine at a loss and made it up on advertising, that's when it started. And that attention economy that leads to the clickbait of today ruins a lot of the experience. And the really bad news sites you go to that are jamming ads at you everywhere, it's a horrible experience. So we agree. And I think what has to happen is that advertising itself has to change, and it's way behind. Nobody wants to argue with the advertiser because the advertiser pays the money. But advertising has to change in that it has to be less the voice of the company to the public and more the voice of the company to the public. Try it again. Less the voice of the company to the public, more listening and being the voice of the public to the company, and changing that feedback loop around. Advertising is
It's
stupid.
more than irritating. People's lives are destroyed.
Well, but it's not because of advertising cookies. It's not because of advertising. There's other data that becomes vulnerable. Advertising knows that you looked at those boots, and those damn boots follow you around for 6 weeks all over the web, even though you already bought them because the advertising is stupid. But the fact that you like boots is not terribly damaging to you.
Except
the kind of
that
data
it's-
that gets out is from different places.
It's part of this economy that, it functions in the shadows. We sometimes see it, if you go to your web browser settings on your phone or your laptop, you'll see thousands of companies you never even heard of. If you subscribe to Have I Been, is it Pwned? Where the data breaches happen are companies you've never even heard of that are buying and selling your information. The company that makes the car I drive sells data.
The Vizio
My
TV
insurance
sells
company
data. Yes,
sells the data.
That's not necessary, but that's not the web. That's not the advertiser. That's
Yeah.
them and your interaction with them.
Yeah.
So back in the day when I worked at Time Inc. and I started Entertainment Weekly, we used a data company called Axiom, and it had tons of data. And the difference is it had your name and your address included in that. A lot of the web data does not have that. It's not identifiable. And I used to freak out students. I would try to demonstrate this to them. I could go on to their web interface and I could say, and I'll be creepy here for a moment, give me the names and addresses of women who are between this age and this age, who live within this distance, who drive a nice car, and are educated. That's creepy. And that occurred long before the internet. That occurred in ways that data exists out there because of your grocery card, because of other interactions you have directly with the company. So it's less about cookies and advertising and more about other issues of companies. And we need privacy regulation, so let's regulate it. But what happened was I mark the Wall Street Journal in 2010, Rupert Murdoch did a series on what they know. And it demonized the cookie and made it bad. Now, in fact, we screwed up. We, meaning the media industry, the advertising industry, the technology industry, because we weren't open with people. We didn't say why we were doing what we were doing. We didn't give them any information. We didn't give them any power over it. We didn't give them any chance to change it. That was stupid. And so the moral panic about data and privacy and all of that is our fault to that extent. But I still don't think it's surveillance.
I don't take any responsibility for all of this.
Well, you're in public media. You have underwriters, not advertisers.
Yeah, fair enough, fair enough. Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. I want to thank you, Jeff, so much for your time and insights, and thank our audience. Some great questions. Sorry we didn't get to every last one of them, each one of them terrific. Thank you for joining us tonight. Jeff will be signing copies of his book in the lounge outside the auditorium right after this. And last but not least, Commonwealth Club World Affairs warmly encourages you to come back for future programs, become a member, support the mission of nurturing vital civic education, engagement, and dialogue. To find out more, please visit the website at www.commonwealthclub.org. Thank you so much. We look forward to seeing you all again.